you can't really talk about open source software development without first defining what open source software is, because not everyone here in this room, I know for a fact not everyone here is an engineer, and I know not everyone here is an advanced developer, and what open and free means is quite different depending on the context. So just for the sake of completeness and clarity so no one gets lost for the rest of the talk, open source software is software with source code that anyone can inspect, modify, and enhance. And not only can you do that, you can also monetize on it. You can take any piece of code that you find online that is open source or under a copyleft license and put it into your own apps or your websites and make money off of it without paying royalties. This is what's known as free software. But there's two types of free software that exist. There is free as in free speech and free as in free beer. And unfortunately, most people misunderstand which one's which. And the reason there's a difference is because of the English language and the semantics around the word free. Free as in free speech means liberty, or in many other languages, it's libre. Free as in free beer is price, gratis. So free as in free speech is this type of software. It gives you the ability to do whatever it is that you want with that software. Free as in free beer is something like, is software that you get for free, but you can't peek into the source code. So think about Adobe Acrobat, the PDF reader, or Adobe Flash Player. And for many of us who don't want to admit it at some point in their career, Adobe Photoshop, the Pirate Bay edition. So that is free as in free beer software. So we're talking about free as in free speech today, so open source software. So I'm giving you you're giving me rather, the next 40 minutes of your time, so I figure I should at least give you, prove to you that I know something about this topic. So as of this year, I reached the not $1 million, I wish, million download mark for all my iOS Cocoa, my open source libraries that are distributed via CocoaPod. So anything I've written in Swift and Objective-C has, over the last 5 years, been downloaded over 1 million times. I have 7,200. Thank you. Appreciate that. I have over 7,000 stars on GitHub on my personal projects. I've contributed to Swift 3.1, and I'll get into how to do that later on and tell you what I did. And I have, what's it called? What else have I done? Oh, yeah, I've contributed to the Swift Source Compatibility Suite. And it's pretty easy to do that, and I'll tell you how to do that later as well, because I'll cover that project briefly. And because I love writing open source, and I realized I was starting to hit some of these landmarks, I wrote a Swift command line script, and this is a dump of what it looks like. It's called getFame. It pretty much, you put in the user's name, and it'll dump out all your stars and forks for GitHub, for your GitHub account. So this is one way I can keep track of it. And it was just a fun thing. It was my first Swift command line script. And I got to use Grand Central Dispatch in a command line script, and I've never done that before, so I thought that was pretty cool. So it's available for free on GitHub as well. All right. So one thing I want to say is I don't have a computer science degree. And this specific slide is geared towards those of you who are self-taught or out of a code school or a junior developer right now. You can do open source without having the very basics, because you'll pick up the basics in the process. And by doing open source software, you'll learn the basics, because if you solve the right type of problems and you put them online, other people will find your code and will assist you and will help you put in best practices over time. And you'll learn those algorithms when you need to learn them. And you'll learn how to deal with people in the process. You'll learn a lot. A lot of the things that you'll learn in computer science, in a computer science program, you'll learn just by contributing to open source. This is pretty much a guarantee. Just given enough time, you'll get there. So hopefully, any of you here who are ever afraid to contribute to open source because you felt like you don't have the right pedigree, hopefully I've dispelled that notion at this point. So Felix Krause, the creator of Fastlane, which was owned by Twitter, now owned by Google, he gave a similar talk a few months ago at Try Swift. And he defined open source projects. There are 4 levels or 4 stages. So I've adapted his slide here, and I've slightly slightly shortened some of what he said, because I want to get a specific point across. So there are 4 types of open source projects. The most common, by far, are those projects that have no adoption, meaning that someone decided to write a piece of code, wanted to store it online, thinking they'll get back to it, or actually wrote a project they wanted to open source and are actively maintaining, but no one has found that project. No one has put an issue. No one has contributed in any way, shape, or form. So it's essentially a project that could be dead or a project that is alive and healthy, just no one knows about it. So that's a project with no adoption. Then there's a project with adoption. At the very lower end, this is when at least one individual that you don't know or that has not contributed to the creation of this project has actually opened an issue or a pull request or fixed the README or posed a question or contact you in any way, shape, or form about this specific project of yours because they found it interesting. And having that first person come in, that's the best feeling in the world. Imagine having an idea, putting it out there, and then someone somewhere else in the world, on the other side of the world sometimes, finds this thing in the middle of the night and is like, hey, this is awesome, but it could be better if you add this feature or whatnot. And that's the best feeling in the world, and kind of get a high and kind of gets you on the roll of doing more open source. So I told you there are four groups of projects, but I've pretty much defined no adoption and adoption. So what's left? There's the gold standard project. So those are projects that are the community-accepted solution for a very specific problem. So if I ask everyone in here who's been doing iOS development for at least a couple of years, what is the gold standard project for networking? Everyone here is going to say AF networking or Alamo Fire. You may not agree that it's the gold standard. You may not want to use it. You may say, you might use something else. But everyone here has heard of Alamo Fire AF networking at some point in their career, just because it's everywhere. And there are other libraries that are built off of it, like Swifty.json, which is a popular JSON parser, has, I think, hooks into Alamo Fire or AF networking. Moya, which is a networking library, also has hooks into AF networking. So when your library gets to a point where other libraries are creating extra features in separate libraries, that is a gold standard project. And the last project, I'm taking this directly from Felix, is a hyperscale project. So at this point, this is a project where there's at least a full-time paid employee working on this on an open source project. So think about Swift. Apple pays real people real money to build Swift. Realm pays real people real money to build Realm. Mozilla pays real people real money to build Firefox and everything that goes into that. So these are the 4 levels of open source projects. I've been lucky. I've had the pleasure of working on all of these projects. I personally own projects that fit in the first 3 categories, and I'm going to spend the next few minutes or next little bit of time going over some of these projects and what I've learned, the lessons that I've learned through working on these projects. So, but to do that, I want to go journey back into the past, into a time before everyone made a JSON parsing library. So to make this slide, I'm trying to remember what the most famous ones are based on what I saw. So these, to me, are gold standard libraries. And then before that, a couple years back, people were making syntactic sugar auto layout libraries. Everyone had one. And since I'm on a podium, I'm going to say that in the holy war that is programmatic auto layout versus auto layout and storyboards, I fall on the storyboard side. So I didn't actually get to use any of these auto layout libraries because you can't really do that. And we can discuss afterwards if you want to argue with me. And before even auto layout libraries, there were asynchronous image downloading libraries. So for those of you who have been doing iOS development for at least 6 or 7 years, you know when Grand Central Dispatch came out in iOS 4, which is 2010, everyone and their mother wanted to build an asynchronous image downloading library. I even built one, but I did it in 2012. And the funny thing about this is the 2 libraries I remember, one was around back then. SD-WebImage is an Objective-C library from 2009. It is like the gold standard solution for asynchronous image downloading in Objective-C. Kingfisher is a fairly new entry. It's a couple years old, and it's a Swift equivalent. So I've used both. I love both. So anyway. So I'm going back about 6 or 7 years for when I started. So I don't need you guys to yell an answer, but think in your head, what kind of library did everyone build back around 2010 or 11? Just have an idea in your mind. All right. The answer is, and this is the first type of library I built, pull to refresh. And did anyone think pull to refresh? 3 people. Awesome. So so some people here may believe that pull to refresh is actually was built by Apple or Google. It wasn't. It was built by Lauren Brichter. He created Tweety and Tweety 2 for iOS and Mac. And then for Tweety 2, he created the pull to refresh gesture. He was an indie developer back then and a former Apple employee. So he was hot. Twitter acquired him and Tweety and then turned the Tweety app into the first official Twitter client. And they patented pull to refresh. And then they open sourced pull to refresh, the patent, so everyone could use it. So that's why in iOS 6, which is 2012, pull to refresh became available in, I think, collection view controllers and table view controllers. But back to my story. So back then, there were a lot of libraries that add pull to refresh. The best one was 320. There you go. 320, which I learned recently stood for the number, because I was wondering what this name stood for. I never thought about it. It's actually quite obvious. Now, it's the number of pixels or points for the original iPhone, the width, 320. That's what 320 stood for. It was a UI component library. It added a lot of features that were not easy to make back then in Objective-C, like a mail clone, a photo gallery, and pull to refresh. And unfortunately, at that time, I was working on a couple projects for Ducati and Porsche. I got lucky in the beginning of my career to work with big brands. So as a junior dev, I was working with a couple of these projects. And there's 6 of these. So if you look at these home screens, there's 9 buttons on each one. And 6 of those had table views, and the client requested, or the clients rather requested that they have a manual pull to refresh built in because it was all the rage. So 320, or Facebook decided to deprecate 320 around that time. And I was thinking back then, again, as a junior dev, that, oh my God, I'm working with these big brands. They're going to last. These apps are going to be around forever, which they weren't. And I was going to want to put in code that wasn't going to be deprecated, which is usually a good idea. But every time I looked online, I only found a couple alternatives back then that were really good. One of them was Ego Table View Refresh Control or something or another. I'm sorry, it's been a long time since I've seen that name. And the other one was by an engineer named Leah Culver, and it was pull to refresh. Simple, but it was out of date. So to build my first library, I forked Leah Culver's repository, updated for iOS 4, or iOS 5 at the time, or iOS 5, and added a couple features, and bam, I built my first open source library. I just put it on GitHub, thinking that I've done the research, 320 is dead, everyone's freaking out on Twitter. There's only 2 other libraries that exist, and they're not really well maintained or too complicated. So here's a nice, simple solution that Arthur's built, and everyone's going to want to use it. Also very wrong. This library had 0 adoption, which is fine. You live, you learn. But I learned a couple lessons in the process. The first lesson I learned, which is quite obvious, but when you search these 2 terms together, you only see a couple results, which is we're like blacksmiths, and we get to create our own tools, which is really cool. It's really lucky. There's only a few vocations that exist that are able to create their own tools. The only one I don't mention here is mathematicians, right? Mathematicians create more math to solve more complicated math problems. We do the same thing with our code. We create more code to solve more problems, and then we introduce bugs. Mathematicians don't have that problem, and I don't know if blacksmiths do either. But it was cool. So once you start thinking like this, you get this realization that programmers are that you're like a blacksmith, that you create your own tool, you're going to want to start to create a lot more tools. I'm pretty sure this is how the microservice paradigm started. You're like, I want to create more things and stack them on top of each other. And that's the mindset I got into. Like, building one library got me into wanting to build more libraries, which is what I did. And over the course of the last 5-6 years, I've built dozens of libraries. And it all started here. The other lesson I learned is gumption, or just taking the initiative. So I was working at an agency. Well, I was working at Fueled in New York, which is an agency. And they are the ones who had these Ducati and Porsche clients. And while I was there, we found out on a Thursday or Friday that 320 was going to be deprecated. And I took the initiative and just built the pull to refresh library over the weekend. I was a junior dev. I had quit my previous career in physics to become an iOS developer, so I felt like I had something to prove. And to make myself feel better, to kind of fight the imposter syndrome, which I had back then and which I still have to this day, I decided to take the initiative and build it. So I go to the lead dev on Monday with a fully documented open source repository on GitHub and say, hey, I wrote a solution. These brand apps are going to be around forever. We should put in a library that's built by someone that is going to work at this company forever, which I didn't. I left 3 months later. And so we can maintain this project in-house without having to worry about external dependencies. And they liked it. They loved it. I gained a lot of clout inside the company for doing something on my weekend and taking the initiative. And that was like a feedback loop, right? I got a little more confidence. I kind of worked on my imposter syndrome. I had a library out there. I was feeling really good. And these 2 things have stuck with me because building these libraries and getting at least one other user or getting someone to give you the feedback saying this, I appreciate you spending your free time building this. It's a great feeling. You know, and as a software engineer, you know, I have this thing personally where I have 2 left hands. I can't build things for the life of me. You know, I can hammer, but that's about it. So I feel like I can't, but having the ability to program and write code and actually build things and show other people and have them utilize it in their software, that gives me the good feeling that I don't get by building, you know, things with my hands. That I could normally get that by building things with my hands. Because I have a father who's very, very handy. So I got to fight that issue too. So anyway, gumption, taking the initiative. So next, I want to talk about a couple more projects with very specific lessons that I learned that are more technical. So has everyone seen the float label pattern before? Show of hands? OK, half of you. OK, that's good. So the float label pattern is very simple. For a text field or a text view, when you type in text there, the placeholder disappears. But it's good UX. For those of well, it's a biased opinion. I happen to believe that true. To show the placeholder that you just covered your text with above the label. So an engineer or designer or both, I'm not sure. His name is Matt D. Smith. He created this pattern and put it online. And then a guy named Jared Verdi created the first iOS implementation, JV floating label text field. But he missed one feature in there, which was this feature right here. All the text disappears 1 letter at a time. It animates out when you push the clear button on the text field. So I said, I want to build this library myself, because I also wanted some custom features on UI menu controller. That little black bar that pops up with cut, copy, paste. I wanted to be able to toggle those as well, because I had a use case for that. So I figured I have 2 reasons right now where I should build my own implementation. So I went and started and built my own version from scratch, especially to get this animation feature. So to do that, I had to swizzle a UI component. I'd never swizzled in my life at that point, and I never wanted to swizzle a UI component either. But I'm going to teach you how to do it in Objective-C right now. So swizzling is the act of taking a method or a function or any object and changing its implementation. And it's usually done to items that you don't have access to. So we don't have access to certain buttons, like the clear text button in UI text field. We don't have access to it. But you can gain access to it and change its implementation, which is what I did here. So I think there's a laser. That's fine. So forget the dismiss keyboard line. So the first thing I did was I got a selector to the clear button. So Apple has a tendency to name things very logically. So I deduced by brute force that the button is called clear button. From there, I referenced the getter for clear button using the imp keyword. And from there, I was able to create a function pointer. All of these things I did not know. This I did research on how to swizzle. Once I understood what I was looking to do, I just Googled accordingly and found out how to write this code. So what I did is I eventually got a pointer to the UI button. And then I learned how to clear all the targets and actions for all the control events. So I knew that there was something on UI touch up inside, but I wasn't sure if they used any other events. So what I did here is I said, you know, I wanted to find a way to clear all the events, just in case there's something on touchdown or something else going on. So I found out how to do that as well. You know, you pass nil to the target, nil to the action, and UI control events, all events to the events, which I didn't know existed at the time. So I learned quite a bit just by wanting to add an animation that disappears 1 letter at a time for UI float for text fields. And I did this for text fields and text views. And this code is available online for free on my GitHub if you want to use it. And I still maintain this library to this day. Except the wonderful thing about Objective-C is it doesn't change every year. So I haven't had to touch this code in years. But I still maintain it. Anyway, the other thing I learned is on a library I built called Guitar. And this library, the whole point of it was I wanted to build a cross-platform library, meaning that it works on all Apple platforms and on Linux just because. It just got into my head that I want to do that. Mostly because I wanted to get into server-side development, and I looked at the types of libraries that were missing, and I saw that there were a lot of string libraries that existed on JavaScript and elsewhere. And I wanted to build my own, because it didn't exist in Swift, so I wanted to be first. And that is a good motivator sometimes to wanting to do something in open source. So what this function does is it's an extension on string that adds something called Latinized. So what I do is I transliterate text or characters or graphemes from a string into their Latin components. And then I remove the accents just to make it like English letters only. letters in the English language, rather. So pretty much every line in here was something new that I learned. The first line is @discardable result. So this is a keyword introduced in Swift 3. So what it does is, or rather, let me tell you the problem before telling you how it solves it. So if you've ever had a function that returned a value and you didn't want to save that value into a let or a var, the compiler complained. It would say, you need to do underscore equals that function. So you essentially just throw away that value. What @discardable result does is it says that this function, it silences that warning. So you can still return something to a letter or a var, but simultaneously you can avoid doing that if you don't want to. So in an open source library, there are certain functions sometimes where you may not want to force the person who is integrating your framework to have to print out that value for whatever reason. So I decided that in the strings library, sometimes a user may not want to do that. So for every extension that I added, for every new function I added, which was around 30 new functions, they are discardable results. So I got a question one day saying, why don't you make all of these properties on string? And I said, you can't use discardable result. So that's the reason I used functions for everything. The next thing I learned is the OS macro or attribute. I forgot what it's called these days. So I learned how to target or not target very specific operating systems. So in this case, I wanted to make sure I don't target Linux with the line of code that I want to execute. And then after that, I wanted to make sure with the available macro that I only target very basic, the minimum targets of iOS 9, macOS 10, 11, and so on. And then from there, I learned how to actually transliterate a character using the apply transform API, which I didn't know existed on string. Just because I wanted to add this feature, Latinize, that I saw on a JavaScript library, I learned all of this, which is pretty awesome. I would never do this in my day job. So what's the key takeaway here? Oh, yeah, and by the way, assertion failure is something that only happens in debug mode. And essentially, it's the same thing as an assert, except it throws a message in your console. So these messages will never crash your app. These will on production, but only on debug mode. So the key takeaway here is you get to experiment with APIs that other people may find useful. We build apps to solve problems for other people, and we put them in the App Store to make money. In this case, you get to build something to solve problems, but you're doing it for yourself. And you're doing it under your own timetable, under your own restrictions, and you're learning the things that you want to learn. So this is a good way to expand your knowledge of both languages and platforms. And this is exactly what this library let me do. And this is the library that is part of the Swift source compatibility suite, which is why I have all this OS Linux and available stuff, because it would crash. What the source compatibility suite does is it runs a bunch of libraries, open source libraries, against during the continuous integration process, during their testing process, against both Linux and Mac machines. So this function would crash on one machine, on one environment or the other if I didn't add all these conditional statements in here. Again, something I don't do at my day job usually. So next, I want to talk about gold standard libraries. So, and I'll talk about this game as well. So at the Washington Post, my team and I, we built the first game, or second game they've ever had, but this was the first mobile game. And it was essentially Flappy Candidate for the election last year. It was called Floppy Candidate. Sorry, Flappy Bird, but we called it Floppy Candidate. So these are 3 screenshots from the open source repository. So what these repositories do is they check the current version of the app in the App Store versus the one you have installed in the app. And then they present you with an alert, one of 3 alerts. You have a choice as a developer what you want. Do you want it to force the user to update the app? So it totally locks the user out of the app if you want, which is bad UX. But there might be certain times when this is appropriate to do. And then it gives you the next time option. So next time you do a cold launch, it'll allow you to do that. It'll prompt you again. Or you can skip this version. So same thing with those rate this app banners that you get from the Apparator and iRate libraries. So there are 3 libraries that do this. 2 of them are mine. Harpy and Siren, Objective-C and Swift. And I've been maintaining Harpy since 2012 and Siren since 2015. And I've learned a ton building these libraries because I only wanted the ability to present one type of alert conditionally, and that's it. But in the process, tons of people have come to me, and I've learned a lot of things. So the first thing I learned is how to deal with package managers. So CocoaPods, I don't remember when it came out exactly. I think it was around 2012 or 2013. But was asked to integrate CocoaPods. So I learned how to deal with CocoaPods. And then someone asked me for Carthage. And then no one asked me for Swift Package Manager, but I figured I might as well do it because it's supposed to be the next big thing, which it isn't yet. So what's interesting is when you support 3 package managers, your repository becomes very weird looking, because each of them are opinionated and have different rules that you have to implement. And they're not mutually exclusive. Sorry, they are mutually exclusive. Rather, they do not depend on each other, and they can all live together, but they're totally different sets of rules. So for CocoaPods, you need a pod spec. That's it. It's great. That's why I love it. For Carthage, you need a sample project with a shared scheme and a dynamic framework target where all your source code is in the dynamic framework target, including, I think, the bundle, in case you have image assets. For Swift Package Manager, it's the most opinionated. You need a file called sources, a folder at the top level directory called sources where all your source code must live. And then you need to add a package.swift file that has to be formatted a certain way and specify the major version. So if you add Carthage support and then Swift Package Manager support, it's a pain in the butt. So a lesson here is do CocoaPods first, then Swift Package Manager, and then Carthage, because otherwise you're going to be moving files around inside of Xcode and inside on your disk, and you're going to get a bunch of unconnected files at that point. So I learned how to deal with package managers. And at the Washington Post, I am the tools guy. I'm one of 2 people that deal with all the issues with Fastlane and CocoaPods and Carthage because I have an abnormal amount of experience working on the consumer end with these tools and opening issues as well on some of these projects or contacting various developers at the time through Twitter, blah, 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 and so on to deal with these. So I learned through running these 2 libraries how to deal with a bunch of package managers, including Git submodules, which are just nasty. Continuous integration. So after I worked at Fueled, I worked at a couple startups for 3.5 years where I was the sole mobile engineer. They only wanted an iOS developer, and I was the only one. And I didn't have to do any tests. And not having a background in programming of any sort, I didn't really know how to do tests or why I should do them. But I had a really great manager, and he explained why they do tests and how they test their Ruby frameworks. And I started researching and looking into it. And I learned about Travis, and I learned about YAML files, because usually, unless you go into the third-party world, you're never going to have to deal with a YAML file, because you just never have to come across one for iOS, unless you're using SwiftLint or Fastlane these days. But before that, you never had to deal with anything. So I got to go outside my comfort zone a little bit and learn about CI, learn about YAML files, and got to do more shell scripting. So in my previous life, when I was a physicist, I wrote a lot of shell scripts. So it was nice to kind of learn how to write my own scripts. And then I was able to write pre-install, post-install scripts for the CI stuff. And I was able to run scripts write scripts at build time and at compile time as well. So this opened my mind to starting to write in other languages again. And it got me working. It got me to this point where I was now testing by default all the time, which is great. So I became a big tester. Then I learned about internationalization and localization. So most of the apps I've built up until recently have only been in the US, so I've never had to worry about internationalization and localization. And the difference between the 2 terms is internationalization is when you enable your application to work outside of the bounds of your current locale. Like you add features that purposely modify the app. And localization is the actual features that you've added, like the actual the strings that you've changed, as an example. Or maybe right to left versus left to right compatibility. I learned about NS localized string, custom bundles, and these libraries are localized for 40 languages. And I have tests for every string that Harpy and Siren present. For every string that they have, I have tests around it. So I have a couple hundred tests just around localization now. And then I learned how to override iOS system levels localization. So let's say you have an app that you want to gear towards a specific community. Let's say the Russian community, but they're all in the US because this might be like a local thing. And you want to be able, usually what these libraries do that I build, they usually default to whatever the system setting is. But a lot of people don't know how to change the phone settings from English to Russian or English to any other language, especially if they bought the phone in this country and they live in this country full time. But the app is specifically geared towards Russian speakers. So what you can do is I learned how you can force Russian into these notifications to give a better experience. So again, something I would never do, but now I know how to do, and has been useful because at the Washington Post, what we're doing is we're selling our software to a bunch of other partners. And we have a partner in Argentina, so we have to localize stuff for them. So now this became useful for me in my career 3 years later. And this is the most important lesson, I think, here, which is being a maintainer versus being a consumer. After a while, I stopped using my own libraries. I only have to implement it once, and it's good to go. But over time, as more people found out about these libraries, and at this point, I have 70,000 downloads a month around both of these libraries, people start posting issues and pull requests, and they are the ones kind of furthering this. So all I really do at this point is say, hey, this is cool. I'll add this feature in my free time. Or if you want, you can open a pull request with your implementation. And then I'll clean it up to make sure it follows my preferred coding paradigm. And that's great. That's how all these languages came in. That's how certain features came in, like analytics. So people wanted to be able to see which buttons were clicked on. So I added a protocol and some delegate methods. And now when people click OK, skip this time or whatnot, it shoots that information to a delegate method, and then they can put their Google Analytics tracker or whatever they use in there and capture stuff. These are features I did not need at the time, but the library has evolved to support these features. And you learn how to deal with people as well in the process, which is a whole other ballgame. So the major takeaway here is maintaining open source projects is very rewarding, especially at scale, especially when you have a project that a lot of people use, but it's totally thankless. People will post things like, this doesn't work, and they give you an error, and they don't explain why. So then you have to deal with, you have to be nice, because it's the right thing to do. And you say, what did you do? Show me the stack trace. And then working on an app that's localized for a lot of languages, you have to deal with people who don't speak English as a first or second language sometimes. So there have been times where people were throwing my responses into Google Translator and responding. I knew they were doing that because the responses they gave me didn't make too much sense. And I was doing the same thing. I was throwing some of their responses or their code into Google Translator to understand what they were trying to say. Hey, that's part of the job, the thankless job, but it's fun, it's different. You get to help people around the world. And something else totally unrelated to this is I recently got in and out of Ethereum very quickly for fun, and I decided I want to mine Ethereum, which is a cryptocurrency, just for fun. And the Mac client didn't work. It's a C++ client. I'm not really that well-versed in C++, but I forked it and I fixed the repository. And then people started contacting me on Twitter and on Facebook Messenger to help them get this client running on their computer, because I had written all the rules, but most of the people trying to mine Ethereum just create a GitHub profile just to be able to understand how to download and leave a comment saying, hey, me too, this doesn't work for me, but Arthur, can you help me? So there were on 2 separate occasions, I VPN'd into a computer in Germany and Russia to help these people get these libraries set up on their, and totally thankless. One guy actually paid me at the end, which was great. I didn't expect it. But it was, I was so used to going out of my way to help people out with these projects that I went as far as spending 2 hours talking to people that I've never met and will never meet across the world, getting an Ethereum client that I did not build set up and working because I felt like it was the right thing to do. Like you get into a more altruistic mindset when you contribute to open source because, it's not fully altruistic, nothing is, because the reward itself is when you get something working and people are happy and thankful to you. So if that is something that you like or something, I feel like everyone loves to be thanked for what they do, then contributing to open source is one way to easily get that. So now that I've showed you some of the stuff that I did, and I have 15 minutes to go over a bunch more slides, I will quickly tell you how to contribute to open source, specifically Swift. Everyone wants to know how to contribute to Swift. Here are the tips and tricks. First, go to bugs.swift.org, click on Starter Bug or under label, and make sure you search for open projects. These are projects that issues that have already been created or vetted by the Apple Swift team, and that they are not implementing themselves because it's not a priority. And they're starter bugs because to them, they're a bit, simplistic to some extent. Not most. Some of them are in C++. Some of them are in Swift themselves. So take a look. You might be able to find something where you may want to contribute, or you might be able to contribute. What I did is I searched for fix me's and bugs and not implemented. And I happened to come across NS unimplemented one time. And I found that it was all over the XC test framework. And that was interesting to me because I had an extension that had this function called XCTest assert no throw, which exists in Objective-C that would test if a function threw or not. And I wanted to make sure certain functions were or were not throwing in certain scenarios in my tests. And to do that, I had to create my own extension on XCTest case and carry it to every single project I'm working on. And as we are selling our software, I had to carry this over from one project to another. And I got sick of it, so I looked into where it was supposed to be implemented in XCTest, and I saw that it said NS unimplemented. So I asked them what that meant, and they said, we haven't implemented yet. Do you want to do it? I said yes, so I did it at the beginning of the year. It was absolutely nightmarish to get Swift installed on your computer and all the various dependencies, especially when it's active, because things break all the time. So thankfully, Robert Widmeyer at Codify on Twitter helped me out. And we got this. I wrote all the tests on this, but I couldn't get it running on my machine. And running on Swift CI takes over an hour. So he helped me get everything up and running, and this stuff got implemented. XE test assert no throw, that method got implemented in Swift 3.1. So the other thing you could do is search for fix me unsupported, and that also means the same thing. Like, they just haven't supported this function yet. So if you want to contribute to Swift in the Swift language, search for either of these two inside of Corelib's Foundation, Corelib's Dispatch, and Corelib's XE test and Swift, and I'm sure you'll find something in there. Next. Contributing to projects. So here, so I don't know if any of you follow Ryan Nystrom on Twitter. He's one of the iOS engineers at Instagram. He has this new GitHub app called FreeTime, which lets open source developers manage their notifications. It's not even open source, any developers manage their notifications on their phone. It lets you quickly see them, mark them as read, and reply to them right from the app. So he has done everyone a favor by posting the features that he wants to build and the issues that he wants fixed. And anyone can come in and leave a comment and then start implementing it themselves. So as a future open source developer, if you have a project and you have 1,000,001 features you want to add, just list them out. If someone finds your project and they're like, yeah, I want to do this, they will do it for you for free. And it's great. Next, what's it called? You can also contribute to established projects like Swiftlint. All you have to do is search for starter tasks, helps, features, or bugs. By default, I think new GitHub projects come with most of these labels. But many bigger projects, especially in our community, have these tags set up so that you can look for open issues with these labels, and you can just start contributing that way. I have a rule that I want to implement in Swiftlint. I have an implementation. It was not approved, but I have not had time to re-implement it. So the rule is something about throwing a warning whenever a function that is supposed to throw doesn't actually throw in any way. It doesn't throw, rethrow, et cetera. So my implementation wasn't ideal, and I haven't had time to get back to it. But if any of you want to start to contribute to open source right now, go there. Swiftlint number 1315. And it's an open PR, and you can see the entire discussion. Next, creating your own project. It's a lot of hard work. You want to make sure, perception is key in everything that you do, right? So you want to make sure your brand new project is super documented. Take the pictures, please, everyone. So first, you need to add a README, and you need to document everything that you want to do. Like, just document everything. Add a table of contents. Make use of Markdown. Make use of all the different header styles. Now, document every public line of code. If your code returns, write what it returns and why. If your code takes in 6 parameters, write what they are and why. If your code has a discardable result, make sure that it's announced in there. Also, document your private code as necessary, because if people are going to be adding new features, they're going to need to understand what the existing hidden encapsulated features do. Use Jazzy, which is also by Realm, which also makes Swiftlint, to create a static HTML file that has all your code that you documented printed out to the web. Use tests and hook up continuous integration. Both Travis and BuddyBuild will allow you to do free continuous integrations through their platforms if your project is open source on GitHub. Also, I don't see this as much, and I don't personally do this because I usually tend to build small utilities, so my vision isn't that large. But if you have a huge vision for a document, build a vision.markdown file, and just write what you want to achieve, and then let people comment on it and potentially start building features from there. And then, like I showed you earlier, add issues for future features as well, and mark them with starter tasks. I don't practice everything I preach because I tend to create small utilities, as I said. But if you have a project that needs to be really big and you have a lot of things planned, do all of this. And then when people happen to stumble across your project, they will know what to look for and how to get started. Now, the question is, how do you market your library? You ping everyone you know. You go to every mailing list, the big ones and the small ones, and you tell them why your library is the best. It's kind of like marketing an app. If you ever said, how do I get my app on the App Store, you'll find that there's this website that has 300 links of saying which websites to send a 5-sentence pitch to, and say maybe they'll write a blog post about you, and then your app will become, you'll get a big bump in the App Store. All of these people, especially Dave Verwer, I can't pronounce his name, but I'm going to say Dave Verwer, and Natasha the Robot have helped me tremendously in my career. Anytime either of them have promoted one of my libraries, and Dave has done like 6 of them, I have gotten a huge spike, and it creates network effects, because then other newsletters pick it up in other languages across the world, and I start seeing huge spikes of people starring, forking, or visiting my GitHub account, my GitHub library. GitHub has stats for where people are coming from. When people write posts on, then they'll start writing posts on Medium. There was a few people that wrote, Siren is one of these libraries I love using. Another library I have called Font Blaster made its rounds as well, twice. Once when I wrote it a couple years ago, and then once again very recently. And I just saw a big bump in there as well. So all of these people have helped me in some way, shape, or form, and I wanted to just call it out that this is the way you get your libraries out there. This is how you get people to adopt it. You can't just assume people are going to come to you. It's the same thing in everything in life. You have to put yourself out there. So this is one way you put yourself out there. There's no shame in asking for help. And on Twitter, the hashtag SwiftLang and iOSDev. I will tell you that I am very annoying when it comes to this. When I have a new library, I will tweet it. I will retweet anyone that puts it out there. I will email these people. I will tweet them. I will tweet them a second time right before their newsletter is supposed to go out, imploring them to please give me a little byline somewhere, because I think the problem that I built is, the problem that I solved is relevant, and I hope they do too. And if they do see it, they'll publish it. And if they don't, no hard feelings, because I know maybe next time they'll do it. So this is how you get your stuff out there. All right, now finally, down to the last section, maintenance tips and tricks. First, issue templates. So GitHub has the ability to make sure that whenever someone wants to create a new issue on your repository, that they get pounded with, that's a bad word, they get presented with a list of common issues that you have already solved, so you don't get duplicate issues posted. So all you do is you put a file called issuetemplate.md into this, your repository's top-level directory. You create a GitHub hidden folder, and you put it in there, and it'll just put it out. So I knew that people always ask for macOS App Store support for Harpy and Siren, and I said, no way. Apple doesn't love the App Store on the Mac. I don't love it either. Why would I spend the time writing this feature? If you want to do it yourself, and then maybe I will add it into the master code branch. And there were other common issues that I've come across. And so this has helped tremendous. Once this feature came out, I stopped getting duplicate issues, because it started helping. Next is pull requests versus issues. There is a post online that gives some benefits to disabling issues. You can disable issues on your project if you want. I don't do it on mine because I don't mind helping people with common problems. It actually usually means that my documentation, my READMEs aren't that good. So that helps me fix my READMEs by speaking to these problems a little more often. What I've noticed is once I added a table of contents, people started leaving less of these issues around the manual. So the benefit of turning off issues is it forces people to read the manual. And if by only having pull requests available, they have to actually change something in your code, in your code base. So they have to attempt to add the feature that they want or fix the bug that's causing them their issues, which may not be ideal. But hey, it's less work for you at the end of the day, because then you only deal with people who've already actually gone through the motion of understanding how your code is supposed to work. And then most importantly, not everyone actually knows how to fork a GitHub library or what fork does. This kind of make sure that the people that don't know how to do it don't contact you, because you may be an engineer who doesn't want to deal with people who don't know how to even fork a GitHub library. I don't know. I'm not this person, but this is something I saw online that made the rounds not too long ago. And then this is my own rule. This is called the 5-day rule. So if someone posts a new issue or a new pull request, and then I followed up saying I need a change or I need more clarification, and they do not comment within 5 workdays, so Monday through Friday, I just close the issue and say you can comment back if you want. This has added a lot of, it made my life much saner, because I'm someone who likes, I hate seeing badges on my phone. I hate seeing an issue that says 1 or 2 or 3, because knowing that the person hasn't responded. So I just flat out close an issue after 5 days. And the person who opened it can reopen it on their own free time if they want to, but most of the time these people don't come back. So they just kind of came to ask me a question, didn't like my answer, and decided they didn't want to deal with me. Their loss, or my loss, I don't know. It doesn't matter to me at the end of the day. It's their loss. Next is a quote from Linus Torvalds he's a creator of Linux and Git, and he has this whole thing about network of trust. So essentially, he's saying, give the keys to the kingdom to someone else on your projects, because you can't be the single point of failure, especially on a hyperscale project. So he maintains the Linux kernel, but he doesn't. If he had to accept every single pull request and comment on every issue before it was approved, Linux would never be where it is right now, right? He got it down to, by adding more people into his network of trust and allowing them to release builds and to merge versions of the app, merge features and fix bugs. He's gotten, I think, the release times to new versions of Linux to, I think, 2 or 3 months. And this was a few years ago when this came out. I'll tell you, for me, I have this developer named Aaron Brager out of Chicago. I have never met him. I have never spoken to him outside of Twitter and text messages. And he helps me with Siren and Harpy. He's just someone who decided he wanted to help, and he's helped me for years now. I still have never spoken to him on the phone or anything. But he has full admin rights to these projects, and he can delete them if they want or push them or whatnot. But I totally trust him because he's been there and he's helpful. And yeah, I don't know. I practice this. This has been very tremendously helpful for me. So hopefully, if you get a project that's big enough, you will trust other strangers on the internet to help you out if you see that they're committing a lot to this project. All right, a couple more slides. Deprecating a project. This is how 320 deprecated their project. They moved everything to Facebook Archive, which is another project that they own, another team that they own, and then they just say it's an archive repo, but they give you the commit. Maybe it's not in the screenshot, but they list the commit. Oh, yeah, it is. They list the commit at which the code base was at, because they also deleted the code base from the last commit, because they wanted to make sure people knew that this was a deprecated library. The other thing you could do is what Jesse Squires recently did with his JSQ messages view controller, which was a drop-in clone of the messages UI. He just gave it to the community and said, I can't support this anymore. It's yours. Get together and build the Swift version. I don't want to do it anymore. That's another way to deprecate a library. You make a big announcement, especially on a project that big, and you allow the community to take over, and you give your initial opinions, and you just move away. So last piece of advice. So I tend to read a lot of self-improvement books just for fun, like The Power of Positive Thinking, The Power of Habit. This is from The Power of Broke, which is by Damon John, the FUBU shark on Shark Tank. So he says in his book, he has a bunch of principles at the end, and this is Broke Power Principle number 4. Understand that you will be rewarded for solving other people's problems or filling holes in the marketplace, just as you will be rewarded for helping others reach their desired objectives. In other words, if you can figure out how to do something better, faster, easier, and more efficiently than anybody else, and if you can make somebody else's life a little smoother in the bargain, you're way ahead of the game. He says this with respect to being first, being to the market, solving a problem, and making money off of it. I'm saying this with respect to karma. I have had a lot of good things happen to me by doing open source. I have had a lot of people reach out to me saying, hey, do you want to write this book? Or hey, do you want to work for us? Just by looking at my GitHub profile. This is stuff I did for free on my free time, but I would never have had the jobs or offers that I've had, or the experiences that I've had, or even sometimes even the ability to speak if it wasn't for my willingness to give away a lot of my free time. So you may not get paid for this, but you get rewarded in other ways, which I think is tremendously useful. And lastly, one of my favorite, actually my favorite XKCD comic, and for those of you in the back if you can't see, on the left side it says, never have I felt so close to another soul and yet so helpless alone as when I Google an error and there's one result, a thread by someone with the same problem, and no answer, last posted to in 2003. Who were you, Denver Coder 9? What did you see? So I want all of you, when next time you come across this problem, if you end up finding the solution, post to that thread that you find and post the solution and link to the solution that you write. So someone who comes 10 to 15 years later, God, that would suck if the same problem existed for 30 years. Someone who comes in 10 to 15 years can come and actually benefit from something that you did in your free time. Thank you.